"Call me boss when we're at home," Calvin said, his tone calm yet commanding. I froze, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. His words hit me like a bucket of cold water, unexpected, sharp, and impossible to ignore. My stepfather wasn't asking. He was telling me. This wasn't the Calvin I thought I knew. The man who had entered our lives a year ago had seemed so charming, so kind. My mom was smitten with him from the start. I didn't have much say in their whirlwind romance, and before I knew it, we were living under the same roof. He always seemed in control, the type who could command a room with just a glance. But that night, his control shifted to something far more. "Excuse me?" I said, forcing a nervous laugh, hoping I'd misunderstood. "Boss," he repeated, his eyes locking onto mine. "When we're at home, that's what I want you to call me." "Why?" I blurted out, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. He smiled faintly, almost like he was amused by my reaction. "It's just a game," he said with a shrug, as if that explanation made sense. But it didn't. Not at all. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, his words looping in my mind. Why would he say that? It was so bizarre, so deliberate. And what did he mean by a game? Games had rules, didn't they? But this felt like something else entirely. The next morning, Calvin acted like nothing had happened. He poured his coffee, read the newspaper, and asked how school was going, like any normal stepdad. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. His casual demeanor only made his words from the night before feel heavier, more calculated. For days, nothing happened. No mention of boss, no strange looks, no new demands. I started convincing myself that maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it was just an awkward joke, and I'd blown it out of proportion. And then, one evening, he brought it up again. We were alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. My mom had taken an extra shift at work, leaving just the two of us. I was stacking plates when he leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, a faint smirk on his face. "You still haven't called me boss," he said, his tone casual but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I froze, gripping the plate in my hands. "I thought you were joking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do I look like I'm joking?" There it was again, that calm, unwavering tone that left no room for argument. I looked at him, trying to read his expression, but he gave nothing away. My heart pounded as I forced the word out. "Okay. Boss." His smirk widened, satisfaction glinting in his eyes. "Good girl." Those two words sent a shiver down my spine, and not the good kind. From that moment, the dynamic between us changed. It started small, tiny corrections, subtle commands. If I hesitated or pushed back, he'd just smile and remind me it's part of the game. I didn't understand the rules, and maybe that was the point. He was testing me, pushing boundaries I didn't even realize existed. One afternoon, he walked into the living room while I was watching TV. "Pause it," he said, standing in the doorway. "Why?" I asked, annoyed at the interruption. He tilted his head, raising an eyebrow. "Because I said so. Rule number 1, when I speak, you listen." I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or argue. But the look on his face told me he wasn't kidding. Reluctantly, I picked up the remote and hit pause. "See? That wasn't so hard," he said, his tone almost patronizing. I hated how smug he looked. I hated how he made me feel small. But most of all, I hated that I let him win. By the end of the first week, the tension between us was palpable. He didn't have to say anything. His presence alone was enough to remind me of the rules. One night, as I passed him in the hallway, he stopped me. "You're learning quickly," he said, his voice low. "Learning what?" I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. He leaned in slightly, his gaze intense. "How to follow." Those words lingered in the air long after I walked away. If you think this is intense, just wait. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about trust, control, and myself. And trust me, you won't believe how far it went. The next few days passed in a strange, tense silence. Calvin didn't bring up the boss thing again, but his presence was louder than words. His eyes followed me constantly, like he was waiting, watching for me to slip up, to unknowingly break some invisible rule. At first, I convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe he'd forgotten about his strange game, and things could go back to normal. But that hope shattered one evening while I was cleaning up after dinner. I was at the sink rinsing plates when his voice cut through the quiet. "You still haven't called me boss, Sophie." My breath caught in my throat. I turned, gripping the edge of the counter, hoping I'd misheard. But the look on his face said otherwise. His voice was calm, casual even, but there was something beneath it, an expectation I couldn't ignore. "I thought you were joking," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "Do I look like I'm joking?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt too small, the air too thick. My instinct screamed at me to push back, to walk away, but instead, I heard myself whisper, "Yes, boss." His lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. "That's more like it," he said, his tone dripping with approval. I didn't know why those two words felt like a surrender. I didn't know why I hated how his approval made me feel, like I'd passed some unspoken test. From that moment, everything changed. The game wasn't just a strange quirk anymore, it was a daily ritual. Calvin started adding rules, small at first, but with every day, they became harder to ignore. "If I ask for something, I expect you to do it immediately," he said one morning as I was pouring cereal. His tone was casual, like he was commenting on the weather, but the weight of his words pressed down on me. Another time, when I forgot to take out the trash, he stopped me in the hallway. "You missed something," he said, handing me the bag with a small, knowing smile. "Rule 2, pay attention." It felt like he was rewriting the house rules, one small step at a time. If I ever hesitated, he'd just shrug and say, "You agreed to this." But I hadn't. Not really. One afternoon, he called me into the living room. I was halfway through a school project, but his tone left no room for argument. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the couch. I hesitated but obeyed, sinking into the cushions. "You're learning quickly," he said, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Learning what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "How to follow." My stomach twisted. I didn't like the way he said it, like it was some sort of achievement. But I didn't say anything. The tension grew with every passing day. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but soon, the lines between our roles blurred. He wasn't just my stepfather anymore, he was something else, something harder to define. One evening, as I was putting away laundry, he walked into my room unannounced. I froze, clenching a stack of folded clothes. "You forgot something," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "What?" I asked, confused. "Rule 3, always thank me when I help you." "Help me with what?" I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "With everything," he said finally, his voice low and steady. I wanted to argue, to push him out of my space, but my words caught in my throat. The way he looked at me, calm, composed, but undeniably dominant, left me paralyzed. "Thank you," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good girl," he said, his tone soft but loaded. It wasn't long before the rules became more intrusive. He started testing me in subtle, deliberate ways. One night, as I was watching TV, he stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Pause it," he said. "Why?" I asked, annoyed at the interruption. "Rule 4, when I speak, you listen." I stared at him, my hand gripping the remote. I didn't want to give in, but the weight of his gaze pressed down on me. Reluctantly, I hit pause. "See? That wasn't so hard," he said, his smirk cutting through me like a blade. I hated how smug he looked. I hated how he made me feel small, powerless. But most of all, I hated that I let him win. One night, after another tense interaction, I decided to confront him. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with frustration. He leaned against the kitchen counter, his expression unreadable. "Because you need it," he said simply. "Need what?" "Guidance. Structure. Someone to show you who you really are." His words left me speechless. Was he manipulating me, or did he actually believe that? And why, despite everything, did a small part of me want to believe him? By now, the game wasn't just a game, it was my life. His rules dictated everything, from how I spoke to how I moved around the house. I didn't know how to break free, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted to. If you thought this was intense, just wait. The stakes only got higher from here, And what happened next changed everything. His rules became bolder, more invasive. Every interaction felt like a new test, a new challenge. It wasn't just about listening or following orders anymore, it was about control. His control over me. One evening, I brought him a cup of coffee. It was something I'd done a dozen times before, but this time, he didn't take it. "You didn't ask permission to leave the kitchen," he said, his voice calm but firm. I froze, confused. "What?" "Rule number 2, he continued, leaning back in his chair. "Always ask before you act." My cheeks burned with embarrassment. "You never told me that," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "I shouldn't have to," he replied, his tone so matter-of-fact it made my stomach twist. "That's the point of the game, trusting me to lead." I clenched the cup in my hands, my knuckles turning white. It was so unfair, so arbitrary. I wanted to argue, to push back, but I didn't. Instead, I swallowed my pride and muttered, "Sorry." His lips curled into that faint, knowing smile that I was starting to hate. "Good girl," he said, taking the coffee from my hands. I hated how those 2 words made me feel. Like I'd passed some twisted test, earned his approval. And I hated even more that a small part of me wanted to hear it again. The next few days were a whirlwind of unspoken tension. Every interaction with Calvin felt like a trap, a game I couldn't win no matter how hard I tried. One evening, as I was heading upstairs, he called after me. "Come here, Sophie." I hesitated but obeyed, walking back into the living room. He was sitting in his usual chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Sit," he said, motioning to the couch across from him. I sat, my hands fidgeting in my lap. "Do you know why I asked you to stay?" he asked, his voice calm but loaded with something I couldn't quite place. I shook my head, unsure how to respond. "Because you're learning," he said, leaning forward slightly. "And I want to see how far you'll go." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Learning what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How to follow," he replied simply. I stared at him, my stomach churning. I didn't like the way he said it, like it was a compliment, an achievement. "You think I need this," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. "I know you do," he replied, his gaze steady. That night, I lay in bed replaying his words over and over in my mind. "How far will you go?" The question haunted me, gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Was he testing me, or was this about something else entirely? The next day, his rules became even more intrusive. He started dictating my movements, my choices, even my thoughts. As I was doing homework at the kitchen table, he walked in and leaned against the counter, watching me silently. "Rule 3, he said finally, breaking the silence. I looked up, confused. "What?" "Don't ignore me," he said, his tone light but his expression serious. "I wasn't ignoring you," I protested. "You didn't look at me when I came in," he replied. "That's the same thing." My jaw tightened, and I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Sorry," I muttered, though the word tasted bitter on my tongue. "Good girl," he said again, his smile widening. By now, the game had taken over my life. Every decision I made, every step I took, felt like it was being monitored, evaluated. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into something I didn't fully understand. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, I finally snapped. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, standing in the doorway of the living room. My voice trembled with anger, but there was fear there too. Calvin looked up from his book, his expression calm, almost amused. "Doing what?" he asked, as if he didn't already know. "This," I said, gesturing around the room. "The rules, the tests, the control. Why are you doing this to me?" He closed his book slowly, setting it aside as he leaned forward. "Because you need it," he said simply. I blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. "Need what?" "Guidance," he replied. "Structure. Someone to show you who you really are." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know how to respond. Was he manipulating me, or did he genuinely believe that? And why, despite everything, did a small part of me want to believe him? The tension between us only grew after that. His rules became less about practicality and more about control, pure, unrelenting control. One evening, as I was folding laundry, he handed me a small card. "What's this?" I asked, eyeing it suspiciously. Your next task, he said, his tone as calm as ever. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots as I flipped the card over. The words on it made my breath catch. Prove your loyalty. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You'll figure it out, he said, his expression unreadable. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words on the card echoed in my mind, taunting me. Prove my loyalty? How? And why did I feel like, no matter what I did, it wouldn't be enough? The game had consumed me entirely. Even when my mom was home, I felt Calvin's presence like a shadow that never left. His glances, his tone, even his silence, it all carried the weight of unspoken rules. One evening, he handed me a small card. What's this? I asked, hesitating as I took it from his hand. Your next task, he replied, his voice calm, but his eyes locked onto mine. I flipped the card over, and the words made my stomach drop. Prove your loyalty. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, tilting his head as if the answer should be obvious. You'll figure it out, he said, his tone carrying a dangerous edge of anticipation. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The words on the card echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing hour. Prove your loyalty. What did he mean? And why did I feel like this wasn't just another task? I couldn't sleep. My thoughts raced as I tried to predict his next move, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The next day, Calvin's demeanor was different. He was calm, as always, but there was an intensity in the way he moved, the way he spoke. It felt like he was waiting for something. At one point, he approached me while I was folding laundry. His steps were slow, deliberate, and when he stopped just a few inches from me, my breath caught. You'll show me today, he said quietly. Show you what? I asked, my voice trembling. That I can trust you, he said, his voice low but firm. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Trust? Wasn't that what this whole game was supposed to be about? But this felt different, bigger, heavier. That evening, the tension between us was unbearable. Every glance, every word felt loaded with unspoken meaning. As we sat in the living room, the silence stretched until it felt like it would snap. Finally, he spoke. Do you know why I gave you that card? He asked, his voice breaking the quiet like a stone hitting water. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent response. Because you're ready, he said simply. Ready for what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. To stop holding back. The next task wasn't written on a card. It was spoken, soft and deliberate, as he stood in front of me later that night. I want you to trust me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Completely. My chest tightened as his words sank in. There was no mistaking what he meant. This wasn't about small tasks or arbitrary rules anymore. This was about surrender, complete and total. I wanted to say no. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to walk away, to end this game once and for all. But I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. You've come this far, he said, taking a step closer. Don't stop now. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to turn back. Calvin's words, his presence, the weight of the game, it all pressed down on me until I gave in. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I didn't pull away. His touch was careful, deliberate, but it sent a shiver through me. You can trust me, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to prove that I could follow his rules, that I could be everything he wanted me to be. And in that moment, I did. That night, I felt like a different person. The line between the game and reality had dissolved completely, and I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. You did well, he said softly as we sat in the dimly lit room afterward. Better than I expected. His words should have made me feel proud, but instead, they left me hollow. I didn't know who I was anymore, just that I wasn't the same girl who had started this game. You've earned this, Sophie, Calvin said, his voice low and deliberate. There was something in his tone that left no room for doubt. This wasn't part of the game anymore. It was something more, something that had been building for weeks. That night, the tension finally broke. The dim light of the living room cast long shadows on the walls, making the air feel heavier than it had any right to be. Calvin sat close to me, his knee brushing against mine as he turned slightly, his gaze fixed on my face. "You're tense," he said softly, his words laced with something that felt both reassuring and dangerous. I didn't answer. My hands rested awkwardly in my lap, and I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. He reached over, his fingers lightly grazing my wrist. The touch was so faint, so careful, that it sent a shiver through me. "Relax," he murmured, his voice dropping lower. "You don't have to fight this." His hand moved up, tracing the line of my forearm, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that felt deliberate, almost reverent. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. His fingers moved again, trailing down my arm and resting lightly on my hip. "Trust me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes as his hand slid up my back, his touch careful but insistent. His other hand reached out, grazing the curve of my cheek, tilting my face toward him. "You don't have to do anything," he murmured, his lips so close I could feel the warmth of them against my skin. "Just let go." His thumb traced along my jawline, a motion so slow and deliberate that it felt like time had stopped. Then, finally, his lips brushed against mine. It was light, tentative at first, like he was testing the waters. But then the kiss deepened. His hand slid further down my back, pulling me closer. My heart pounded as the space between us disappeared entirely. His hands moved like he was memorizing every curve, every line. He traced the edge of my shoulder, his fingers brushing against the fabric of my shirt before slipping beneath it. His touch was both careful and commanding, leaving no doubt about where this was heading. When his hand moved to my side, grazing the curve of my waist, I didn't stop him. I couldn't. The warmth of his touch burned through me, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. His lips moved from mine to my neck, his breath hot against my skin. I tilted my head back, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as his fingers slid lower, tracing the curve of my hip. The moment was electric, charged with everything we'd been avoiding for weeks. And then, the line we'd danced around for so long was finally crossed. When it was over, I sat on the edge of the couch, my breathing uneven, my thoughts spiraling. Calvin leaned back, his expression calm, almost satisfied. "You know we can't go back now," he said, his voice soft, almost comforting. "I know," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. I should have felt guilt, shame, regret, but none of it came. Instead, I felt something else, something dangerous. A sense of rebellion, of power. The next morning, the weight of what had happened settled over the house. I woke to the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. My mom's presence was heavy, her anger palpable even before I saw her face. "You thought I wouldn't notice," she said, standing in the doorway, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. I froze, my heart racing. How much did she know? How long had she known? She stepped into the room, her movements slow but deliberate. "Get downstairs," she said, her tone icy and final. In the kitchen, Calvin stood by the counter, his face unreadable but tense. My mom stood between us, her arms crossed, her glare cutting through the air like a blade. "You're leaving," she said to him, her voice trembling with restrained fury. He opened his mouth to speak, but she silenced him with a look. "I don't want to hear it. Pack your things and go." An hour later, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the remnants of the game he'd started. That evening, I found the box he'd used for his tasks. It was shoved in the corner of his former office, the contents torn apart and scattered across the floor. On one torn card, a single phrase stood out: "This was just a test. And you failed." I stared at the words for what felt like hours, my emotions a swirling mix of anger, regret, and something I couldn't name. But I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, a small, bitter smile that felt like the only thing I had left. "I don't need your rules anymore," I whispered, letting the torn pieces fall from my hands. That night, my mom didn't say a word to me. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. Her final words echoed in my head: "Now live with the consequences." I don't know if life will ever go back to normal. Maybe it won't. Maybe it shouldn't.